Ruler School is brought to you by Odyssey Games, where you can go to get singles for all your Force of Will and other trading card games, as well as these amazing patrons.
Thank you for your support. Enjoy the video.
Hey there, Rulers, DMO73 here, bringing you a feature match for the week between a red-white Brunhild list. I know we had Brunhild last week. This is very different. I like to call it Moon Fall BURNhild. Very, very unique and roundabout way of killing your opponent. And I'm playing against Paul Clute, who is playing a bug, blue, green, black, perfect Loki list. So we'll have to see kind of how this goes out. To speak on the idea of what the BURNhild list is doing, if the name doesn't make it obvious, we're obviously using the moons to try to do some burning damage, but the thing is we needed to be a white ruler because we want access to karmic reversal. So the whole kind of idea of the deck is we get enough moons on the board to use karmic reversal on one of our own things and then burn it to death with our Nyarlathotep or a Surtur, so that our opponent just takes all that damage to the face in one massive explosive burn spell. So it's very, very interesting, and so we'll have to see kind of how it goes. So turn 1 stone, we hit that red, we see Desert Miner, which is absolutely the optimum turn 1 for this deck. We want red-white very, very quickly, and it's a free moon eventually if it gets tried to spot remove. It's also just, free chip damage potential. Paul going to use his Energize here or thinking about using his Energize for Shadow of Kronos, decides not to do that. Instead, is going to use his turn 1 to play Harvesting Season, send those top 10 cards of his deck to the grave, maybe hit himself a Fenrir so that he can bring it into his hand. Next turn, we see another Fire Magic Stone on my side. It's fine with me. The board is clear, so at this point I say let's go ahead and chip in for 4 damage. Every amount of damage that this deck can do to my opponent before having to go off with the combo means 1 or 2 less moons that I have to worry about getting, which is great because it just kind of can burst out the fast damage faster than your opponent can expect. Suddenly you produce all these moons and they're like, what are these even doing here? And then they're just dead. So if they're not ready for it, it can just be pretty devastating. It's kind of a one-trick pony, but it is still a very interesting concept. So on Paul's turn, you see he has that Athenia in hand, no real way to play it. We're going to play that Command of Life and Death to target. And this is something we've talked about recently in the Teacher's Lounge, is that this is a format where graveyard stuff is definitely super important. And so we are actually main decking 3 copies of Burial Rites in the Moon Fall BURNhild list because we want to be able to set it up. Now, I did remove enough Resonators to go search for an Anubis. I don't play one in the deck, so ultimately I still have to just do a dead shuffle. A fail to find. And at the end of Paul's turn, we're going to use that other red to turn it into a white to play a Alice. And you see I ship a another Desert Miner here to the grave. The reason why that is because Desert Miner is a human, so with that Harryar summon, we can just grab him right back to the field. So that's awesome as well. And so now we're going to get to swing in for 6, take him down to 30. So now we're, again, 1 step closer to that finishing burn, and we can just leave up the rest of our 3 stones. You see we have that Surtur there. Essentially, at this point, we're at a potential 4 moons, which is really good. Ultimately, we need... 4 moons with Nyarlathotep is enough for lethal at this point in time. So we're in a pretty good shape. We just got to make sure that we can keep everybody alive so that next turn I can play the Nyarl into, if I have one in hand, play the Nyarlathotep into lethal. But also we have to make sure that we have something to be able to burn with the Surtur in hand to generate those moons as well. So Paul kind of recognizing maybe not necessarily what's going to be happening. He had seen me play this list earlier in the day, so he's a little bit familiar, but his hand is kind of dead in terms of what he can do to what's on my board. So unfortunately, at end of turn, he just has to discard, just discarding Athenia, choosing not to use any of his runes or anything like that. At the end of the turn, we're going to go ahead and use Godly Aura, which is going to generate us a moon and draw us a card, because we don't want to Surtur our own guys, so we're just going to go ahead and wait. And then we're going to go recover. At this point in time, I don't think I have a Nyarlathotep in hand, so we don't see a Nyarl yet. You do see that Messenger of the Sun, which is pretty interesting, but ultimately it's probably just better to just do some chip damage. Paul's going to go ahead and flash in that perfect Loki here. I believe at this point in time he has 5 cards in graveyard, so it is going to be enough to completely wipe the board. And I say that's fine, but in response, I'm going to generate at least a couple more moons. And then I do catch it real quick to also float some white will here in just a second before those go off. You know, sequencing is very, very important, and you can always float will before stuff happens. So when it was still having minor on field, I could float the white, which gives me access to this 1 white here to be able to use Blade of Faith to get rid of that perfect Loki. I can't play any other resonators this turn, that's fine. Ultimately, though, I have 3 runes. 3 moons on board, and I have Surtur in hand, so I have this really nice spot removal that I'm sitting on for 3 will, and eventually, ultimately, all this deck needs is a grand total of 4 will and a Nyarlathotep in hand to just kind of pump out lethal damage if your opponent's not ready for it. So on Paul's side, hasn't really been able to play any of his fixers here, especially not being able to access the green. Command of Life and Death into an Athenia would be very good here. He does have March of the Undead, but there's not really a target for that right now at all. So that's kind of a dead card. A Return of God wouldn't be a bad idea here, just to be able to start like digging a little deeper and maybe seeing something that he wants. We're going to see an Invitation to Purgatory instead. I believe choosing not to remove from game a Satan. One of the reasons why... Oh, no, he does choose to remove the Satan. So one of the things that Paul was wanting to do with this deck, I remember now, is you see there's Deus Ex Machina in there as well. The idea of you play this kind of control game, you get a Satan that has all these counters on it that are just absolutely worthless after it comes into play. And then you just play Deus Ex Machina and eat all the counters off of... Satan, so that you just have this gigantic out of nowhere... Deus Ex Machina. So it's a cute little combo that Paul wanted to try after seeing the Nuking BURNhild list from last week. Calling Stone here for Paul, seeing that second Water Stone, which feels very good at this point. Looks like potentially considering, yes, we're going to see using the Floating Black for a March of the Undead to grab back his Dark Alice that he sent to the grave, I believe, with the Satan. To hopefully set him up to be able to will fix a little bit, get a little bit better answers. Now, while he still only has blue, so unlike last time where I kind of walked into it, while he still only has blue and can't do Power of Immortality, we're going to go ahead and Surtur the Dark Alice. So it's going to take a grand total of 2,000 damage because of the 5 moons. And we just don't want him to have access to that will filtering. We kind of want to lock him out of blue right now. The end of the turn, he still has to resolve the Dark Alice, so chooses to discard 1, and then I believe he discarded a Fenrir at that point. Has access to triple blue. I don't think there's anything in his hand that he can do with it outside of potentially playing Return of God, as you see there. Paul just kind of thinking about what he wants to, if he wants to try to play a card here, just play into like a Return of God, or play Shadow of Kronos into double black for some reason, or anything else like that, ultimately choosing just to pass the turn. Finally seeing a white stone, which feels absolutely great. Playing a Desert Miner here. Starting to follow that up with a Messenger of the Sun. And then paying one more and recognizing, oh wait, I can't, so we're actually going to backtrack here. And again, Paul's a great sport for the sake of these feature matches. The deck actually has 11 Divinity in the rune deck, and so at this point in time, the only other rune that I can use here is the, because I've used everything else, is I have to save it for Karmic Reversal, because if I don't, then I have to try to win this game normally, and I'm not a normal BURNhild deck, so there's not a real way for me to win this game normally. So I have to kind of rely on that kind of trick. At least in this matchup, which is one of the reasons why, yes, this deck is very, very fun, but I mean, if I was going to the meta and play anything that's Hanzo, I'd be in for a really bad time. Any kind of cancel deck would just kind of walk all over this BURNhild deck, but it is a fun idea, especially to have your opponent see that you're playing BURNhild and suddenly you start generating moons and they're very, very confused. So we see a Freed from the Altar here, paying 4 life, which ultimately as a burn deck is great for me. Choosing to grab a perfect Loki here. Potential to see Judgment here. If he had a Fenrir in hand, I could see the idea of Judgmenting into the Neo Ragnarok. I'm a little bit prepared for that, simply because I have Protection of the Angels in hand to be able to save the Desert Miner, but ultimately, you know, we just need to keep some stuff safe. It would be an all-out, like, with my life total so high, doing that Neo Ragnarok isn't necessarily the best option right now, because it wouldn't give lethal, but it would also completely tap him out, which would give me free reign on my turn to just push through for whatever I wanted to do with this kind of moon shenanigans that he's potentially sitting on. There even comes a point where, based on what the deck is, you could even potentially use the, not only the Surtur, but also the burn spell, the 1-drop burn spell, to burn your own guy for lethal here. So there's, you know, merit to the idea of, in this matchup, if he's going to try to target it, give it Protection of the Angels, and then burn him out that way, or anything else like that. Ultimately choosing to not do Judgment this turn, at least not quite yet, playing a Clockwork Girl. Give him access to some green off of the blue stone. Which at this point in time, I give him access to Athenia, which isn't a bad idea. Get him to recover some stones, keep his combo momentum going up here. Oh, tap me out as well. He hasn't called for stone yet either. Try to see if I want to respond to the cast of the Athenia. I just float all the will and say that's fine. You can recover your stones. And still see a perfect Loki Judgment here if he has a Fenrir. We can still see a Return of God to try and grab another card. You know, Return of God into Athenia is really nice because you end up floating an additional will. So you can go from paying 2 will into having 4 will available potentially, which is very nice. Calling Stone, seeing another Water Magic Stone on Paul's side. Shadow of Kronos potentially coming down here really to help him kind of restart refilling the grave. He doesn't have a ton of options in there right now. And it's a lot of spells, which isn't necessarily great when it does feel like his hand is a little bit diminished. Drawing for my turn, not using any of the floating will, kind of recognizing that it was a mistake. Attempting to move to the upkeep, nothing from Paul. This is because the reason why we are very careful about asking if we can move to each individual step is because we know we have perfect Loki in his hand. And so we always want to make sure that we're checking that he doesn't want to like try to do something with it. Starting to play Messenger of the Sun here, ultimately recognizing that I can't do that in order to make the play that I want. So we're going to take that back here in a jiff. Because ultimately realizing that I haven't been able to see a Nyarlathotep yet. I need to find some way to kill him right now because Paul is very quickly coming to a position where I'm not going to be able to cheat past him. And realizing that I'm just one will short, unfortunately. So we're going to see the Messenger of the Sun come back into hand. And again, huge thanks to Paul for being gracious enough in the recording. I even asked him, like, is it okay if I bring it back to hand? And Paul was gracious enough to allow that to happen. So we're going to see actually just a pass from my side of things. So verifying the number of cards in Paul's graveyard currently is sitting at 10. So perfect Loki would flash in for -10 defense. Choosing to pass turn, but before Paul draws on his turn, is saying he's moved to his turn. We're going to see this kind of combo play out here. Knowing that he only has 10 cards in grave, we're going to use Protection of the Angels. It's technically on his turn here to cast and make my Miner a 12/12. That's going to resolve. He can't. Neither player can't chase to it. After that resolves, it also has Barrier, which is very relevant. We're also going to cast the Karmic Reversal on the Desert Miner here. And then once that resolves, we're going to pitch the Surtur to attempt to summon 2 moons and burn my Desert Miner for 28 damage, which will then get reflected back to Paul instead, and he'll take 28 instead of me. The reason why we played the Protection of the Angels was because we wanted to be able to make sure the Desert Miner stayed safe, and being at 12 defense, seeing what was on his board, he had to wait down to get to 11 cards in his graveyard, which is not enough for perfect Loki. Knowing what's probably in Rune Deck, there's nothing instant speed there. We haven't seen any cancels or anything else. We haven't seen any discard. There's not a lot that deck can do at instant speed outside of the perfect Loki. So, and something like Keys' Call wouldn't matter here or anything else like that. Like, he wouldn't be able to cast it. So we felt pretty safe in trying to go this route, knowing that even if he flashes in the perfect, he wouldn't be able to kill the Desert Miner, which means if it's alive at all when this Surtur triggers, resolves, then he's going to be taking the burn damage for the 28, and that's going to push us to lethal. So Paul's doing a lot of digging here, kind of thinking about some stuff, goes to mill, looks at a Keys' Call. Ultimately, not going to be something that affects him right now. There's no automatic ability that's going on the chase, as it were, right now. And he starts to produce the will for Fenrir, but Fenrir says remove this card from the game, not discard it. If it said discard, that was actually Paul's 1 out. He could discard it to the grave, produce the black, flash in perfect Loki, deal 12 to the board, which would kill my guy before it takes any damage, and so therefore he would survive and most likely win the game at that point. Unfortunately, though, Fenrir says it has to be removed from the game instead of discarded. So Paul's going to take a look at it and say, nope, I got nothing out of there, burns for 28, and then we go to next game.
As we go into the next game, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell down below so you're notified when all of our videos goes live, and consider supporting the channel by being a member here on YouTube or checking it out on Patreon for all the cool exclusive perks that come with supporting us. Thank you guys so much. Let's go to the next game.
So in game 2 here, Paul choosing to take the draw again. We've talked a lot about how in this format it actually does seem better to be going second, simply because you have the energize to be able to punish your opponent's plays more. And like that seems to be really relevant, and having the extra card is also seeming to be really relevant. So Paul, even though he lost game 1, chose to go second as well. For a deck that's running blue and black, kind of a necessity, but is also running both of those stones, having the blue off the top is a good way for him to kind of start things off too, because he'll always be able to have a turn 1 blue play if he's going second. So Desert Miner on the top on my side, seeing a water stone on his side, which is not what he wants really, because he can't do a turn 1 harvesting season. Choosing to play the Clockwork Girl, go to my turn, see a white stone, absolutely what I want to see. First, I want to see a red and then a white, so that I know I have access to Nyarlathotep Will just off of my stone base. Knowing that he probably doesn't want to lose the Clockwork Girl because he probably wants to be able to play Machina, we're going to go ahead and swing in for 4, get there, go down to 36. Again, it's that chip damage. Every single attack is a piece of damage on Moon that I don't have to worry about presenting or generating. Second blue stone off the top feels really awkward at this point in time for Paul. You see he's got a couple black cards in hand, I think 2 Command of Life and Death, but he doesn't have a single way to be able to play the harvesting season at this point. Playing the Arthur, choosing Blade of Faith here in response for his like barrier target, which is fine. I don't mind that at all. Ultimately, my deck is really trying to kind of ignore my opponent's deck as much as possible and just push for what it wants to do. And the spot removal is there for like bigger threats that might be barreling down on me. Ultimately, a 6/6 Arthur that's going to draw him 1 card total because he's not Arthur is not a threat to me. So flashing in Dark Alice here at end of turn. Seeing a discarded Messenger of the Sun, and then a discarded Desert Miner, same kind of play as before. And then also from Rune deck, gonna go ahead and cast Godly Aura, generate a Moon, and draw a card. So this deck actually has a surprising amount of draw power to it. You just kind of got to be really careful and balanced about how you're going to execute it and win. Another stone, another red stone, hit 1 more white stone, sets me up for perfect will to be able to pull off the combo regardless of what my board state is. I'm going to go ahead and choose to use the Einherjar summon again to bring back the Desert Miner from Grave. Once again, it's essentially pay 0, generate a free Moon. So this is a passive damage, like it's a passive blocker, 1, it's potential chip damage, 2, and it's just a free Moon for 0. And the longer I get to sit on those moons, the less, I have to get to do a full 40 damage. I need 5 moons. At this point in time, with what you see on field, I have 3 of them, which is already in a great spot. And I still am sitting on Open Will, which is probably going to be able to be used for Asserter, which generates my last 2. So at that point in time, I'm even sitting at potentially, based on what I have in hand or what Paul plays on field, a potential lethal next turn because I'll be at 4 Will. And ultimately, the deck needs a grand total of 4 Will to pull off the combo of playing Nyarlathotep into Karmic Reversal into Burn Ourself for lethal. Paul finally seeing that Darkness Source, a little too late at this point in time. There's justification for playing Harvesting Season here just to fill the grave. The problem is that in doing so, he sets himself up. I mean, he can't play anything as a follow-up play because he hasn't seen that Shadow of Kronos yet. If he had a Shadow of Kronos in hand, a really greedy play could be to energize in Shadow of Kronos, play Harvesting Season, and then use the 2 Water Stones as 2 potential black sources for a Command of Life and Death. Ultimately, though, in seeing all the Open Will that I have available, and seeing that there was the spot removal for the graveyard before, that could be really punishing, because he could try to go for that all-out play, taps himself out. I punish him with a single copy of Burial Rites, and then at that point in time, he's so far behind that there's no chance of coming back. Grabs the Lancelot, which is an absolute probably best pick that he could grab right now because he's got a board full of machines, because it is setting him up to be at a grand total of, at this point in time, he has 13 counters on board, so he has access to the Lancelot board wipe. Pays 1, decides to set up the harvesting season for a future turn. Fenrir to hand to be able to produce will next turn, sitting on a grand total of 1 blue will here, to see if there's something that he can make of it. End of the turn, we're going to go ahead and try to bring in the Surtur to try to kill the Lancelot. When the Surtur resolves, it's going to do a grand total of 12 damage as it stands right now, and which is enough to kill it. This is just me saying, like, would you like to board wipe and kill my 3 1-drops, two of which I'm going to banish to produce extra moons anyway, and one of which is just a generic 2/5. Like, how much are you willing to invest in response to this, as opposed to if I just let me kill it, then at that point in time, my guys are safe. I can start potentially swinging in for attacks again next turn, force some potential awkward plays, chip you down, and still get to where I need to be. One blue in hand. At this point in time, I don't think there's anything in his hand that he could do to stop that. I think it is just down to whether or not he wants to wipe the board in response. And that's the interesting thing about the BURNhild list, is it's really not trying to swing a face with Nyarlathotep. It's really just trying to play her and then immediately burn your opponent to death. So I don't actually commit a lot of large bodies to the board before I need to. So we're going to go ahead and see the board wipe happen here. Clockwork Girl is also going to die. He's going to pull all the counters from Clockwork Girl, which will trigger to let him get a potential machine off the top. I'm going to banish the 2 Desert Miners in response to the Lancelot, get 2 extra moons. That'll all resolve. Another moon comes in. Clockwork Girl immediately dies. He gets to look at the top and see if it's a machine. Looks like it was Sacrificial Altar, so that's not going to do much at this point, and leaves him with a generic 3/3 Lancelot that can't be Blade of Faithed. So I'm sitting on 5 moons. He's got 1 will available. Unfortunately, don't see the white stone there, which is what I needed. I absolutely needed the white stone. If the white stone had been there, we had lethal on board. There was nothing automatic ability about any of this stuff that would have stopped me. So there was nothing with 1 blue outside of potentially a bounce spell. If Paul was running them, that like a Skyfall. It would have to be a Skyfall or a Shayla's Return to be able to stop the play. We're going to play the Soul Resonance here. The Blade of Faith is not really doing much here, so we're just kind of committing to not needing it so that we can grab the Desert Miner. Desert Miner we're going to hold in hand so that we can set up for having White Will next turn if we need it. We're not going to invest it onto the board right now. It's not going to do us anything right now, and we would rather have the Desert Miner in hand for when we get our 5th stone, so that if our 5th stone is a Firestone, we still have the ability to play double white, because there's no chasing outside of the initial summon of Desert Miner. So once it hit boards, I can float all the White Will I want, which sets me up to be able to play. So you see there, I do have a Burial Rites in hands. I think I have a couple of other options here, so I'm feeling pretty comfortable, but ultimately choosing to just pass the turn, leaving the 3 will open. Paul looking at his hand. See See, looks like we see a March of the Dead. Still only has access to a grand total of 1 black as it is right now. We could justify potentially doing a perfect Loki judgment into a Neo Ragnarok, but then we're in the same position before, where if he's not able to kill anything, if he's not able to find that lethal this turn, he's tapped himself out, at which point in time, you know, who knows whether or not he's going to be able to do anything to come back. There is justification potentially for the idea of doing a perfect Loki judgment here into casting, if he's got an Athenia engrave, you cast Command of Life and Death, target an Athenian engrave, summon it back, target another Athenian, you know, tap down all the stones. Like, there's all this cool combo potential. The question is, does it end with him being tapped out, and does it end with me dead? If he doesn't, he knows that my deck is literally designed to take him from 40 to 0 in one move, and I don't care how many Kais he has on board. So he's got to be careful about that. Ultimately choosing to do Call Stone instead, just to be able to have some potential more will to play with. Hopefully, I think he's probably hoping to see another Darkness Stone. Doesn't really pay off here. He sees another Water, which really just locks him out of a lot of stuff for the turn. This point in time, not even able to play Invitation to Purgatory. Paul's really just discussing right now, like, is there anything that he can really do to get out of this? Chooses to say, well, let's at least do this. We'll go ahead and swing in with Arthur, get that 3 damage in. I'll take it, go down to 37. And then looking what's in his hand, he's got a grip full of black cards and only 1 Darkness Will to use it. Like, there's an Athenia in hand as well, but never got access to the, never was able to keep the Clockwork Girl around. Paul's doing a good job here of utilizing the clock to at least think through everything. And this is definitely a format where failing to see an option can be very, very punishing. And if you've got time on the clock, you should probably consider using it. You know, obviously you don't get to get too crazy, but you do want to at least not jip yourself out of potentially seeing the line of play to get yourself out of something by trying to rush through. If your opponent is okay with where the time is at, you got to be mindful of that. You just gotta be careful, but taking your time, looking through every card to see where your potential outs are, what your potential opponent's outs are, everything else like that, it's definitely a part of where the game is at currently. Ultimately, unfortunately, no spot removal in his hand really either. So Paul's going to go ahead and play March of the Dead. I believe he's targeting Shadow of Kronos, so he gets access to the Darkness Will, at which point in time we're going to go ahead and Burial Rites. We don't want him having access to more than 1 Darkness Will. Now that he's spent his 1, we want to keep him out of that color. So Paul starts to scoop it up because he knows that there's nothing really he can do. But I'm going to go ahead and walk you through the combo here on my side because I want to show you kind of what the idea was. So we didn't really see it in game 1. So it's this idea. We hit the White Stone off the top, which is great. We play Nyarlathotep. right out of hand. We immediately Karmic Reversal it, and then every moon that we burn onto Nyarlathotep is just 8 damage at your opponent's face. So that is the match. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Deck profiles will be uploaded this week. And until next time, this is DMO73 saying class dismissed.